We live in a society and a cultural context in which victimhood confers invulnerability. There is a competitive victimhood reality. And I think when you point that out, people get really upset. You're saying, well, should we not care for victims? And I'm saying, no, if you want to care for real victims, don't incentivize victimhood. The thing that will keep real victims from being cared for well is if everybody is trying their best to be put in the victim bucket, because if you get there, you get the steering wheel. Everybody will have to do what you say, right? Because the people that will actually end up getting the steering wheel and getting their way are not actual people who have been damaged and want to be faithful, right? Who have been abused and just want to be healed. It'll be opportunists, and it will be victim advocates who are opportunists who will immediately try to jump on and steer that ship. And so you don't want to incentivize that.
Welcome to the Plain Speech Podcast. I'm Michael Clary. You're going to love this interview that I have for you today with Dr. Joe Rigney, who is a fellow of theology at New St. Andrews College in Moscow, Idaho. And Dr. Rigney is also one of the speakers at the King's Domain Conference coming up in April in Cincinnati, Ohio. And the theme of the conference is gendered virtue, men and women who take dominion. And it's going to be about helping men and women know what God's design is for sexuality and how they can live it out in their personal life and in their households, marriages, as parents, grandparents, as children. It's going to cover the themes of sexuality as it applies to the household. And the speaker lineup is fantastic. Dr. Rigney will be there. Michael Foster, Toby Sumpter, Shane Morris, and others will be there. So please consider coming to this conference. I would love to see you there, meet you personally. And if you'd like to find out more information, you can go to a website, which is genderedvirtue.com. And the cost is really reasonable. We've worked hard to keep the price low. So it's only $119 per person. And that's really good for this caliber of speakers that'll be there. So I hope to see you there. Check out the conference. And then in the meantime, enjoy this episode. Thanks for tuning in. I'm excited to have Joe Rigney with me on today's episode of the Plain Speech Podcast. Thanks for being with us, Joe.
Hey, glad to be here.
Well, to start us off, I have an urgent question that is on everybody's mind that we should get out of the way first. If you were a grandmother who's been invited to her gay grandson's fake wedding to a trans dude, what gift would you bring?
Jawbone. Donkey's jawbone.
There you go. Very good. Very good. I like that. It's a little test of your quick wit.
Or perhaps 300 foxes and a lighter.
That's right. I did an interview yesterday with Toby Sumpter, and I had a little goofy question to start off with him too. But anyway, so all joking aside, thanks for being here. I've got a lot of serious questions I want to ask you. But I'll start this first one off with a little background. The reason why I invited you on the podcast is I've enjoyed your work for years, followed your writing and seen you different places where you've spoken in public. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to invite you to our conference, King's Domain Conference in April. Theme is gendered virtue, men and women who take dominion. But then in that conversation, I had heard that you have been doing some work on how people can emotionally sabotage leaders. And I have read Edwin Friedman a couple of years ago, and that book was very helpful. And I was super excited to see that you've been doing work on that. And as I thought about this, it's like leaders are not just senators and CEOs, but really anybody who's responsible for leading other people, including pastors and church leaders and husbands and that sort of thing. So you sent me a draft of your book, Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, and I read through it, and I loved how different themes of the conference, which was the initial thing that prompted me to invite you on the podcast, but then the book, these themes converged in the book. And the themes are men and women were different. God made us differently. We think and relate differently. We're inclined to different sins and temptations, and we're also prone to exhibit virtue differently, and God created us to exhibit virtue differently. And then the other theme is that an ingredient of emotional sabotage that no one is willing to talk about is how this plays out between the sexes. It's like people talk about church conflicts or challenges like this as though there are no sexual dynamics at place. It's just androgynous individuals who are upset about something. So what I wanted to ask you then is, can you just start us off by talking about chronic anxiety and how this is at the root of a lot of our problems today and how this works out in interplay between the sexes?
Yeah, so chronic anxiety was Edwin Friedman's term for a kind of systemic angst. So anxiety we normally think about as a individual thing, like I'm worried or I'm anxious. And Friedman, that's probably included at some level in how Friedman talks, but really he's talking about something more, systemic, which is one of those fun words that now we have to kind of flinch about because of the way it's used. But there really are interrelated. We're interconnected with each other. And so a chronically anxious system is one in which individuals' reactions sort of ping off each other, and it's just a string of reactions, just boom, 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 boom. It's like emotional dominoes. And so one falls and then it just falls like that. And so Friedman, you kind of use that term in his book on leadership, and it's one that I've found helpful to kind of get at the fumes in the air, that felt sense that like, hey, this place, there's powder, this is a powder keg, this thing could blow. All it takes is one little match and this thing's going up. And that I think is something that Friedman in the 90s was identifying as a feature of sort of our modern culture. That's where we're dealing with that. And I would say 30 years later, how much more? I think the internet, just the way that things have gone, the fragmenting of culture has just increased the angst, increased that chronic anxiety to where we just kind of live in it. And I think that some of that, we don't realize how it filters down and filters up, so that it's not just something that's sort of out there in the culture, but it's something like in your living room. It's in the home, in the way that you relate to other people and things like that, your spouse or your kids. It's in your church in terms of how your pastoral team functions or how you interface with lay people. It's in your school. It's how does the board relate to the headmaster? How does the headmaster relate to the faculty? How do faculty relate to students? How does the parents fit into all of that? Like all of these different things, there's this kind of angst in the air, and that it has a and it's kind of constantly running. It's not something. So we notice it, especially when things blow up. But kind of Friedman's point was it's a perpetual feature. It's just there. And then you have these blow ups occasionally, which draw attention to it, but which are often misdiagnosed. So we think that the problem was that person said something, when really it was, why was there the toxic fumes in the air? Why were we pumping that angst into the system in the first place? And so that if that's the case, then there's particular being aware of and knowing about that is at one level the first step into being able to wisely address it. And so some of what Friedman was doing, and then some of what I'm trying to do in the new book, is to lean into that way of thinking about social entities, bodies, whether household, church, nation, and think about what does leadership look like, and how does that chronic anxiety, that angst, that agitation and turmoil and confusion, how does it pose particular challenges? What are those challenges for leaders? And then how can you be the kind of leader who can overcome and have the stamina to endure it?
Yeah, there's a quote from your book I want to read back to you that I thought it really captured this idea well. He said, our world demands that whole communities adapt to their most reactive, unstable, and immature members. We've turned blame shifting and excuse making into an art, so that hardly anyone takes responsibility for themselves, their emotions, their actions, and their situation. That's like the United States of America,
Yeah, right.
And not just a church or family. Right. This is culture wide, and I think you see it in the panic of 2020, especially. But so many things that were combustible that just ignited in that year. But there was a need for the sort of leadership that you're writing about in your book, and we have not seen that since then.
Right. So I think the notion that we adapt to immaturity. This is a Friedman sort of key insight in his book, and that I think is a real thing. And some of what I'm doing in my book is trying to simply distill. So it's much shorter than his, And his was written in sort of psychological, therapeutic categories with a lot of evolutionary gobbledygook woven in there for good measure. And I was going, hey, the Bible talks about these exact same things. It has just different vocabulary. So Friedman helped identify, oh, that's what that is. And then does the Bible give us similar categories to think about, think about these things and the virtues that we can use to cultivate, to combat them. And so that adaptation to immaturity, the Bible calls people pleasing, like the fear of man and people pleasing, are two sort of fundamental things that the New Testament is full of. Old Testament too, right? Don't fear what man fears. But we often don't recognize how they function, because we think it's just, we fear something out there, as opposed to the actual thing that we often fear is the thing in here. And so it's there that our actual reluctance to confront, or our willingness to bend, perhaps, comes into play. And that's true, like at a very tangible level, like in your home. So almost everybody has experience in their home culture, and no matter how good it was, of situations where the entire home began to revolve around somebody who was the most reactive and immature member of the community. And by revolve around, it was simply everybody walks on eggshells in hopes that they won't blow up.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of adapting to kind of make space for that person. And that kind of, and when I said blow up, in order to avoid the reaction, because the reality is the reactions could take various forms. You could be catering or coddling or adapting to someone who blows up, gets really angry and intense and emotional, or you could be adapting to someone who shuts down, goes passive aggressive, walks out of the room. But in either case, there's this intense emotional reaction that everybody sort of, without even formally speaking it, begins to operate around. And when that's happening, whatever the body is, it's a family, it can't function properly. It can't do what it's meant to do, because everybody's too busy trying to accommodate this, the reactive immature. And so the biblical term for this is passions. So when we talk about reactivity, when we talk about chronic anxiety, the Bible term for that, I think, is passions, which it treats as sort of something that could be good, that by God's design, we have these emotions, we call them emotions now, but these sort of instinctive emotions or intuitive, impulsive emotions. So your anger, fear, desire, pity, these are all sadness. These are all good examples of passions. And they're just sort of like that knee-jerk automatic response you have to something. Well, when that's just kind of the systems, when that's your body's plasma, when that's just what that's the fumes in the room, then everybody's really concerned. We don't want those to go off. We don't want somebody to blow up and somebody to shut down. And so we begin to cater, we begin to adapt, and we don't really realize that we're doing it, because we think, and we're prone to like blame somebody. So oftentimes in a situation like that, it's actually because everybody's agreed without ever saying it that we're not going to cause that person to blow up. Then when somebody decides, you know what, they're just treating me, they're not treating me very nice, and they put their foot down, they have some nerve, and they say, that's unacceptable. You can't talk to me that way. And they do it very calmly. And then the person blows up. Everybody blames the guy who provoked. Everybody blames the guy who put his foot down, right? And they try to, and all of the pressure is going to be like, hey, you know how he is, you know how she is. And all of the pressure is going to be on you to be the reasonable one. And there's going to be all sorts of excuses made for the person who's actually steering things. Well, they were just tired. You know how hard things have been at work. What their home life was like. All sorts of explanations are brought to bear for that person, and you're expected to adapt to it. And this then kneecaps leaders. This is what it does. Is it makes leaders unable to lead, because the moment they try to say, "Hey, we're going this way," and then the reaction happens, they're going to get derailed, not just by the person who blows up, but by all of the reasonable people in the room who are going to put the pressure on to like, hey, can't you be more sensitive? Can't you be more sympathetic, empathetic? Why do you have to provoke everybody all the time? Can't you just be loving?
Yeah, the language used in your book is like a social stampede.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that's the same as what Friedman called herding, like this herding mentality, where because you have the leader's wanting to stand apart from, be his own man or be her own woman, as the case may be, but stand apart, have a calm presence that is not caught up in the hysteria of the moment. And whenever they don't do that, this is one of the things that is really fascinating. Whenever you have a leader that is mature, they're sober-minded, as you describe in your book, because they don't get involved in the social stampede where everybody starts to accommodate and to make peace, and Friedman calls them peacemongers, then the reaction that you get, that the leader is seen to be the problem, as you said. So it could be that good leadership is the one that is surrounded by people that are freaking out, and the fact that everybody's freaking out is then used as a bludgeon to accuse the leader of poor leadership. They said, right, you're being wrong, you're not accommodating us, because they define leadership as accommodating everyone, because that's what everybody else does. And a leader who stands on their own, has their own mind, and doesn't go along with the crowd, they're accused of bad leadership when actually they're being good leaders.
Right.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So, when we think about the modern notion of leadership is really this, especially when it gets brought up with like sort of the idea of servant leadership, which sounds great. Isn't that what Jesus is? Well, not the way that modern people do it. Like Jesus knows where he wants to take us. He has a destination in mind. He knows what the body is for. He knows what God's purposes are for his people, and he's going to take us there in reliance on his leadership. And the modern notion is almost the inverse of that, whereas figure out what the people want and help to make that happen. And so the divinely ordained, divinely given purpose of the body isn't really taken into account. And because it's not, because it's simply you have a leader and sort of the followers, it's all here. It doesn't have anything to do with direction and purpose. Then the leader, simply for trying to take us somewhere, is to blame when some people don't want to go along, and they throw a big fit about it. And so a good leader is the one who's going to say, I've got clarity about what I'm here for and where I want to take this institution, or where I want to take this family, where I want to take this church. And when he takes those steps, he should expect sabotage. He should expect that some people are going to go, we don't want to go that way. And in the modern world, we'll leverage that as evidence of you're being a bad leader because you're not listening well. Which, is it possible that you might not be listening well? Sure. But that's something that has to be demonstrated. And the fact that someone simply claims it isn't actually evidence. And maybe, no, I'm hearing you. I'm disagreeing and saying we're going this way anyway. So I heard it and I'm not doing it. It's the unwillingness to adapt that is the sort of cardinal sin. And because I think people don't really recognize, it takes a long time for people to recognize that that's actually what's happening. It is the more reasonable, often very soft-hearted and good-intentioned people who will put the most pressure on a strong, sober-minded, clear leader. That's where one of the key things that I try to get across in the book is that the most intense pressure really doesn't come from people out there. It's actually the people closest to you that are the most difficult thing for a leader to overcome, precisely because they're not the one who's lighting their hair on fire. They're not being reactive in a very obvious way. Mm-hmm. They're being very reasonable. And so resisting them when they're actually, so they may be being steered by the reactive people, by the immature people, but they themselves aren't manifestly, making a big stink. But they are bringing the pressure. They are channeling that pressure. And that's the more difficult thing for a sober-minded leader to overcome and to go, well, wait, is it good? Is it wise if we do this? I can see how it might placate their feelings, but is it actually good for them? Is it good for the body? For us to adapt in this way?
Yeah. I can just imagine how these things play out in churches. I know I've experienced it myself, and I've talked to so many pastors and church leaders, ministry leaders that are in the same boat, because they experience these dynamics because we're relational beings, and emotions are powerful. And one of the things you said in the book was like the greatest pressure comes from those closest to you. You mentioned that a moment ago too. And I think that pastors, especially in churches, they can find themselves being emotionally sabotaged by their churches. And it hits right in the middle of his life because of the church is a family. And
Right.
the bigger the family, depending on the circumstances, there could be a whole lot of dysfunction in a church family. And that's a good thing. I mean, it's good in the sense that there's a place for people to find a home and belonging in the fellowship of Christians. But they bring that dysfunction with them, and they bring their expectations, unhealthy or not, to that church family. And then there could be, wives talking, and how different little conversations flow here and there, and people might try to backdoor influence to the pastor by getting in his wife's ear, and then she'll go to her husband, but I've been hearing from some of my friends, and I've got this problem, and that. You wrote in American Reformer a week or two ago, and that one paragraph, I've got to hear. It's like I just got to read this paragraph. I'd love to hear your riff on this, because you said in a local church, the problem can manifest when there's a repeated pattern of all male elder meetings in which a difficult decision is made that draws clear lines, and then, after the elders have gone home and talked to their wives, the email and texts start flying. Brothers, I've been praying about it, and I think we need to reconsider our decision. And like I read that, I was like, I have experienced that very thing so many times.
Right. Yes. Right. And so I think so certain people hear that and go, what, you're saying that wives shouldn't have any influence? You don't want women to have any influence. It's like, no, I just want them to have godly influence. So the issue isn't that a pastor's wife might see something, and therefore she could pass it along to her husband, who can factor it into leading a church, right? I've had that happen plenty of times where my wife has been alert to things, and even her friends have been alert to things. So she's been a sort of a channel of information. So the influence thing is a good thing. One of the things I do in the book is to say the head and body relationship, whether in marriage or in the church, is one in which the head is taking initiative and leading with presence and words and deeds, setting the agenda, setting the tempo. But there is a feedback mechanism that God intends for us to use. The body is a source of wisdom and insight by his design. And so a godly wife is a good counselor for her husband, and so it's not that that's bad itself, but it's also the case that it can easily go wrong, especially in this kind of angsty environment, because it is a amplifier. It's an amplifier of the angst. And so when in that scenario, it's not, I carefully chose the words because it wasn't the actual thing that's happening, which is a wife who got angsty about a clear decision that was going to cause some emotional turmoil, which women often are very sensitive to. That's getting channeled to her husband, but it's being sublimated or it's being sort of driven underground in the name of I've been praying about it. Right. And so it's the way that it's not open. This is not an open discussion of, hey, my wife made a good point whenever I told her about it. She said that this could be the result. Do we want to factor that in? That would be open conversation, and it would be about whether or not this is a wise or good decision. Okay. What we're talking about is there was emotional angst channeled, and now we're bringing pressure to reconsider. Mm-hmm. And sort of covering it over with God. And it's a repeated pattern. It's sort of, this is the way that things go, is the sidebar. And that could be true with the wives. It's also true though of if you have a larger elder council, people are familiar with this phenomenon where in the actual decision-making room, when you're actually having the discussion, nobody says anything, nobody objects, nobody makes a case. But then there's frequently an elder or two, usually who are quieter, and won't speak up in the big meeting because they'd have to defend it in front of everyone, but who in the hallway after are going to get somebody's ear, and now we're going to have to reconsider. Like, again, so it's the same dynamic. It's not the gendered thing is a real element and can aggravate it, but it's something that's just true. And the common thread is it's subtle, and it's driven by emotional pressure more than it's driven by what is true, what is good, what is wise. That sort of discussion, everybody should have patience for all day long. That's what leaders do, is debate what's true, what's good, and what's wise for us to do. But when it's not about those questions, but about consequences, right? Is this going to offend? Is this going to cause a blow up? Is that family going to leave? When it's all results oriented, and that's the reason not to do it. So it's, hey, yeah, you could say that true thing. You could do that faithful thing. But if you do, there's going to be consequences. And that's a reason not to do the faithful thing. Mm-hmm. Then we're dealing in a different way. And it's often very hidden. And often leaders don't actually get why they keep getting sabotaged, why they get derailed, why the mission of the church is constantly getting like, hey, I want to go here. I think that God wants to take us. And we all agree in our best moments, that's where we're going. But then it's just like, and you just get taken off. Why does that keep happening? Well, because you're leading well. This is what you should expect, and you should lead through it. You should cultivate the kind of sober-minded stamina to consider it and then to ignore it if it's not good and wise.
Yeah. My great-grandparents got married when they were young, and they stayed true to their wedding vows for 74 years. They lived long enough to meet some of my children, which was their great-great-grandchildren. Unfortunately, healthy Christian households like this have become an endangered species, and Christian understanding of sexuality is often more catechized by the world than informed by a biblical worldview. And so as a result, we have increasing numbers of Christians who lack a proper understanding of masculinity, femininity, and the beauty of God's good design. And so Christians who want to obey God's design for sexuality still need guidance from faithful leaders. To address this need, King's Domain Ministries in Cincinnati, Ohio has invited an incredible lineup of speakers to our annual conference. This year, the theme is called Gendered Virtue, Men and Women Who Take Dominion. The lineup of speakers includes Michael Foster, Joe Rigney, Toby Sumpter, Shane Morris, and others. And our desire is to help men and women know why God created the sexes the way He did, how we can live virtuously and harmoniously with each other, and how all of this is for God's glory and our good. I'm confident that everybody who attends this conference will leave with three things, other than the sweet t-shirt and the other swag that we'll give you. Number one, a biblical blueprint for establishing Christian households that last for generations. Number two, practical application for men and women from experienced ministers of the gospel. And number three, tangible steps that you can take to move forward in your specific situation. This conference is intended for men and women, single or married, or whether or not you have children. You will certainly benefit from the teaching and fellowship that you will experience at this conference. I would love to have you here, and I'd love to meet you personally. We've done everything we can to keep the cost low, so it's only $129 per person. If you want to find out more information and register, just go to genderedvirtue.com. I look forward to seeing you there. I've noticed in my experience that the emotional accommodation to the herd mentality is taken as the way that you love your neighbor. Right. And so if people are hurt, then their pain is an indictment on your action, and it is given legitimacy immediately by the fact that they feel strong emotions about it. And so if that is extrapolated over, a significant number of people, then it's like, hey, this thing that you did was the dreaded hurtful action. Mm-hmm. And because people are hurt, then it must have been wrong, and you were insensitive, and you shouldn't have done that. You might even be abusive and a narcissist, and all the accusations accumulate. When really it's what isn't acknowledged is that we're just letting people's emotions drive how we think, and we're not principled. Of course, I think it is good and wise to at least have an awareness. Okay, this decision is going to be painful. We want to prepare for the fallout of this difficult decision. But often that's like, well, we don't make that difficult decision because the fact that people will be hurt in the process is unchristlike. Jesus would never dare offend anyone or hurt anybody's feelings, so we couldn't do that. And this messed up idea of being gentle, lowly, Christ-like or whatever is driving us at a reflexive, intuitive, emotional level, and it's not rooted in any real scriptural principle.
Right, and because we live in a society and in a cultural context in which victimhood confers invulnerability, there is a competitive victimhood reality, and And I think when you point that out, people get really upset. You're saying, well, should we not care for victims? And I'm saying, no, if you want to care for real victims, don't incentivize victimhood, right? Don't make it the sort of thing where the thing that will keep real victims from being cared for well is if everybody is trying their best to be put in the victim bucket, because if you get there, you get the steering wheel. Everybody will have to do what you say, right? Because the people that will actually end up getting the steering wheel and getting their way are not actual people who have been damaged and want to be faithful, right? Who have been abused and just want to be healed. It'll be opportunists, and it will be victim advocates who are opportunists who will immediately try to jump on and steer that ship. And so you don't want to incentivize that. Instead, you want to consider like you start with the questions of truth and falsehood, with good and evil, faithfulness, unfaithfulness, wise and foolish. Those are the categories. And then having done that, having started there, then you can afford to be compassionate, because your compassion at that point will be tethered to reality. It'll be tethered to the scriptures. It'll be tethered to Christ. And so now you're able to be actually compassionate, because you haven't lost yourself in the emotions of, in the back to the beginning, that chronic anxiety. Mm-hmm. You're not just getting led by the passions, your own or other people's. You're steady, you're stable, you have some ballast, and you'll be able to lead well through it.
Yeah. So I'm curious how you would apply these ideas or explain them, and how they play out differently in men and women. I've heard you say something recently that it summarized a problem I've seen many times in ministry, and that is there was a line that you said on Josh Dawes' podcast, right. And I want to build up to it here, but pastors will be direct and bold when confronting a man's sin. Like, hey, man up, get your act together, because men can talk to each other in a very direct and confrontational way, and that's normal discourse for men. But because we don't, if you have a godly, virtuous man, he does not want to speak to a woman as though she's a man. There's going to be a gentleness, a kindness, an extra degree of tenderness that he'll use in his communication with her, because he is a godly man that wants to honor her femininity as a woman. And then women are, I think, consequently, or at least in a related way, they're presumed to be more virtuous than men. And so godly, virtuous men will threaten wickedness in other men with a zeal and courage and directness. And that leaves room for she-wolves to enter the church and tear the church apart, appearing harmless and sweet because they do it with such a gentle demeanor. And then if you have a godly man that tries to correct her, this harmful woman, then he is piled on and attacked by white knighting men who are weak, but they think that they are doing God's work by attacking the man who is actually trying to correct the problem. And so the way that you said it on Josh Dawes' podcast, I thought was so helpful and concise. And I may be not getting the quote exactly right, but you said something to the effect of, good men don't want to fight bad women. And I'm like, that's it. That is the problem. Good men don't want to fight bad women. Can you explain that more, and what, maybe give some counsel on how to correct that?
Yeah, so it really is, in all of these things, what you're looking at is a corruption or perversion of a good principle. So this is sort of like the baseline, Augustinian point that says all bad things are just corruptions of good things. And we have to be alert for them. And then so that's the Augustinian point. All bad things are a corruption of good things. And then the C.S. Lewis sort of riff on that is, the greater the good thing, the worse it is when it becomes a bad thing, right? So Lewis in Four Loves talks a lot about how the real dangers are when natural loves, the better the natural love, the greater the natural love. Maternal love can become absolutely demonic and evil when it loses touch. You can become possessive. He talks about maternal vampires, right? So you take that sort of maternal instinct to care and care for someone, and it goes off the rails. So that's what's happening in all of these illustrations. Is, here's something that's good. So what's the good? Well, the good is men shouldn't hit girls. Boys don't hit girls. You're told from a young age, you don't wrestle with the girls the way you wrestle with the boys. You treat them with gentleness and with respect. And an additional level of that because they're women, that you show honor as the weaker vessel. So that Peter says that in the context of marriage, but it's because that's an application of the general truth that women as the weaker vessel ought to be treated with a special honor. So that's the good thing. And so when a man feels like I need to pull my punch a little bit, I need to be mindful of my tone of voice a little bit, I need to, all of those things that he, if he's been raised well, if he's been taught well, he will sort of intuitively do. All of that's to the good. But it also then opens up a particular weakness, is that if you want to if the devil wants to smuggle in all kinds of falsehood in a context that has really owned that principle, then using women as the vehicle will be the path of least resistance. Because a guy will say, hey, no, that's just wrong. That's just false to a guy in a direct way. But if he does that to her, and this is especially true if she knows her business, like if she knows how this works, and she probably does intuitively, and you get sort of the progressive girl flop, where here they put forward something, and then when the correction comes, it's like this is why I can't stand watching soccer and basketball to a lesser degree. But soccer's the worst because of everybody knows, like all of the YouTube videos of the flops where he didn't get hit, but he acted like he's dying in order to get the yellow card or the red card, and it's that sort of thing happens all the time. And in a lot of Christian spaces, you can count on men attempting to live up to a chivalric ideal, and therefore doing the white knight thing, where here's the damsel in distress, and so he's actually engaged in something that feels to him noble, right? She's being attacked, which means she's being corrected by a man, and therefore I have to go fight on her behalf. I have to be her champion. And I don't think in a lot of these things, people consciously are like, I'm going to go be the white knight right now. But I think it's ingrained habits. And this is why that language of sabotage is so, it's like, it doesn't have to be malicious sabotage in the sense of there's a plot somewhere. Now I do actually, I honestly know that there are, plots like that people literally are conspiring together. How do we take that person down? That does actually happen. But a lot of times this is just reactive and instinctive and intuitional. And so, but it can be disorienting when you're like, I was just trying to correct the error. And instead I'm getting, I've got this person over here who's going, how dare you? And then these other guys going, yeah, man, what's up with that? And who are acting very white knightish. And so what godly leaders end up trying to do is figure out, how do I avoid that conflict? How do I stay out of it? And now we're back to that first thing we talked about, which is accommodating the most immature and reactive. And the immature and reactive here are both, say, the women who are, channeling false teaching or themselves teaching false teaching, or the white knight men who are just reacting to damsel in distress. And now we're accommodating. So just hope that it doesn't come to your church. Just hope that you can sort of steer clear of it. Avoidance, which effectively ends up meaning abdication. And this is, I think, in terms of, the book that's coming out, which doesn't get as much into some of the gender dynamics of it. They're sort of like latent in there, I guess. You can see it once you know what to look for. But I'm trying to get at, just in general, when this thing is operating, the temptation to abdicate will be strong. And this is sort of the cardinal. This is the first sin of masculinity. This is Adam in the garden letting the devil tempt his wife while he's standing there. It's Aaron at the golden calf being overwhelmed by the distress of the people, and they're saying, give me your gold. It's Saul with after the Amalekites, when the people are apparently, we want to keep the best of the flocks and sacrifice them to the Lord, and you should keep alive the king. And he fears the people. That's the fundamental, that's the first temptation. But where that temptation always leads, if you succumb there, if you fail to take responsibility at that first stage, then it eventually leads to the high-handed rebellion. Eventually, you're going to be doing the great evil because you're going to choose this person's feelings over God, and then you're going to blame them for it. Whenever everything finally comes clear, and now everybody sees the devastation, and they look at you and say, how'd this happen? You're going to go, well, the woman you gave me. Right? Yeah. You know the people, how their hearts are always set on evil. You know how hard it is to be a pastor. I feared the people and listened to their voice. That's what Adamic masculinity does. It abdicates, it commits rebellion, and then it blames the body that led it that way. And this is what the problem. This is fundamentally in homes and churches in the world. That pattern is the thing that we have to break.
Yeah. Well, the faithful pastor, faithful leader will often be the one who is choosing to say the thing that triggers the emotional dominoes to fall.
Right.
And I do think that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, correct me if I'm wrong, but it at the very least, how the dominoes fall or what might be the trigger points will be different for men and women. But women are more emotional on the whole in the aggregate. Mm-hmm. And so there's a desire to cater to the sensibilities of women, and that leaves them under-discipled because things that are more prone, like temptations or sin patterns that are more prone to women, are going to be more volatile issues to address. And it's a lot easier to just hammer on the men and do it in such a way that the women feel like, hey, I'm protecting you from this bad man in your life, bad husband, bad boss, or whatever, the toxic men, when really there are issues in her life, in the lives of women in general, that it's like, I'm not going to venture there, because if I do, you might get upset. And you may call me the dreaded names. And you actually said this in one point of the book. It's like, be prepared to be called names. You need to be prepared. It's like if you're a faithful pastor, they might call you a sexist or a misogynist or some other dreaded label that causes people to just, panic and run for the hills. And I think that what that does is that leaves a maturity gap, or at least a discipleship gap, where women's particular temptations are not seen or addressed because we're afraid of the reaction we might get. Right. Would you say that's true, or?
Yeah, and I think it's certainly true in key places. And the way that you and so this is the thing that you've got to test your own context to see whether this is true. So my running test on this sort of thing is you got your reactions and hesitations are a great test case. So the hypothetical is you're preaching on marriage, and you've got multiple pastors in your church who sometimes preach, and so you're divvying up the preaching assignment. And one week the sermon is going to be husbands, love your wife like Christ loved the church, and something that's going to be from Ephesians 5. And then the next week is going to be from 1 Peter 3, and the message is going to be wives, submit like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And now, and you and your fellow pastors are trying to sort out who gets to preach which one.
Hot potato. You take this one.
Yeah, and so at that point, if you feel something rise up in your throat that says, I know which one I don't want, I know which sermon I don't want to preach, then that's a sign that, like, okay, you know something. And then you need to interrogate that. What do you know? Is it because, and there's a way in which it could be simply the good form of what we're talking about. Like, it will take more effort on my part to show honor to the women of my congregation as the weaker vessels in order to explain that. And that would be a good thing. But as a pastor, you ought to lean into that. Like, who better to do that? Who better to model how to carefully, patiently, and forthrightly address this duty that God gives to wives? Isn't that why you got into ministry? That aren't you needed there? So if you go, I know which one will be tougher, and you go, and that's the one I need to do. Great. Congratulations. That's exactly right. But if you go, I know which one I don't want, because you know that when you preach the husbands love your wife sermon, you're going to you'll preach it straight down the middle, and you'll unload, and you'll be able to speak directly, and not even in the mean way, not even in like the angry, like you guys all suck kind of way, like that. I think more and more folks, more and more guys realize that ain't exactly the best way, that men actually do need some encouragement and not just a hammer on top of their heads. But like, guys, I know it's hard, but do it. But you'll be able to preach it directly, and that you realize if I do the other one, I'm going to have to, there are going to be acres of footnotes in that sermon. There are going to be qualifications up and down the line of, well, now I know when I say this, I don't mean this and this and this and this and this. And then you just qualify the whole thing to death. Why are you doing that? And it's because intuitively, you know that if you don't, you're going to get emails. or you at least think you do. And this is, I think, one of the things that a number of pastors underestimate is that if they actually would just go for it, if they would just say, hey, wives, I know it's scary to obey a fallible man. It was scary for Sarah to do it. That's why she's commended as an example of courage in the Bible. She didn't fear anything that was frightening because she hoped in God. And so I want to say to all you ladies in here, I know that your husband's fallible and it's scary to follow him, but God says, obey your husband, treat him, orient to him as Lord, as someone worthy of honor and respect. You're the lady, he's the Lord. Orient him that way, hope in God and do that. And if you just preach that straight down the middle, I think a lot of pastors will be surprised by the number of emails they would get from godly women in their church going, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Because oftentimes those godly women are seeing the same thing you are in the loud women, in the ones who are who resent their husbands and tear down their house and are noisy and dripping faucets. They see it all and they're like, I wish what do they want? At some level, they want some backup.
Yes.
Like they want to hear their shepherd go, hey, that kind of conduct in this flock is unacceptable because this is God's flock. And they would actually welcome it, receive it. And you would be like, oh, wow. You mean if I actually do what God says, if I actually preach what the Bible says, God blesses it. And you still may get you didn't acknowledge this difficult situation in your sermon. You didn't, and they knew, and they get on you for that, or you said it in a kind of mean way. You may still get some of that, but that's just part of it. That's like, welcome to earth. This is ministry. Don't abdicate. What you can't do is try to outsource your responsibility for half of your flock to who? Women's ministries? Yeah, right. Yeah, like that's honestly what a lot of guys want to do is they, like I did in the article the other day, like the call Rosario option. Like they want to just say, I don't know how to address this female teacher, but the actual danger here is not first from like the more overt stuff, but it's outsourcing theological discipleship of women to women, period.
Yes.
So it's the what I would call the mission creep of Titus 2. So Titus 2, right? Older women should teach the younger women, and it is an interesting thing that in that passage that where Paul is sort of setting out how discipleship in the church should work to Titus. He says, Titus, you tell the older men this, you tell the younger men that, and you tell the older women to tell the younger women this. And so he does mediate some of the instruction through older women. He says, mothers in the church, this actually might come better from them, Titus, than it will from you. So that's not always wrong. The issue is the kind of instruction that the older women should give to the younger women is largely about how do they orient. It's domestic stuff. It's basic obedience stuff. It's how do you manage your home well. The stuff that older women would know how to do better than you would, Titus, because you've never done it. And so that's the thing. What he doesn't outsource to the older women is doctrine. It's not outsource all Bible teaching to the older women in the church, and let them basically be functional pastors for half of your people. Who they're the ones who are going to teach systematic theology. They're the ones who are going to teach all the Bible studies. And so you totally outsource it there. And then you're surprised when about 4 or 5 years later, there's something funny happening in your church. And you go, where's this coming from? And it's like, it came through your women's ministry. You left that gate open, and women are ill-suited for the doctrinal guardianship task in general. It's an unusual woman who really does have that kind of doctrinal bent and fortitude to be able to say no. And so that's an unusual thing. And so you let it in because you abdicated, you outsourced because it was easier to let the woman say it, or because you listened to the voices. This is even among I think conservative evangelicals that basically said, hey, women can learn the Bible too. And you go, well, that's true. Amen. Well, that women can also teach the Bible too. And you go, yeah, I mean, Priscilla and Aquila kind of stuff like that happened. And so, and they teach in Titus 2. And then the conclusion was, therefore, the main discipleship of our women is outsourced to women. And it's like, no, that's not it. Like, you're the shepherd for the whole flock. You're the shepherd for all the people, not just the men.
Yeah. Yeah. I think pastors are tempted to use the role of Titus 2 women in their church, like shock absorbers or buffer zones,
exactly.
that creates this distance between the shepherd and his female flock. And so what you have, and I think it contributes to the under discipleship of women, where men, it's like I go to the men's times in our church.
Yeah.
Me and all the other elders, we're there, we're hanging out with guys, we're having conversations. So it's like men are getting very much direct discipleship and input from the pastors in the church. And then there's this gender segregation where the women are doing the same thing. But there are no pastors there because we don't have women pastors because the Bible tells us not to. And so you have people that are not called nor qualified to be pastors because they're women, providing that same type of discipleship, proximity and instruction, formal or informal. And we do that because we bought into the lie that, well, the way that you honor women is make them leaders. You honor women by giving them titles and putting them in charge of things that the Bible says not to do. And rather than seeing the way the Bible teaches it, which is that actually dishonors women because that dishonors the thing God made her for, and the way that she is meant to relate and learn. It inverts God's design, and that it puts women in danger. So they're under discipled in one sense, and in another sense, you have women that are being put in harm's way that shouldn't be there, thinking that I'm doing what my pastor told me to do. So I'm following the lead of my pastors if they weren't the ones clamoring for it, but they were just responding to the pastor telling them, hey, this is what churches are supposed to do. We need to have women teach systematic theology, and then some other woman will teach hermeneutics to the women. And they're subjecting them to shepherding type of ministry that isn't really appropriate. And so the women get the vast majority of their spiritual input from their church is on Sunday morning. And in that 45-minute sermon, that's most of what she's going to get. And that's, I'll give you one example of this. In our church, we started a women's Bible study. And so I'm teaching it. My wife and I are, we're facilitating it together, but I'm the one that is teaching it, which my wife is pretty shy. She doesn't want to teach. So basically it's like she just comes with me and, is helpful with hospitality and so on. But you do get some strange reactions when it's like, I'm going to lead a women's Bible study. And people are like, that's unusual. What a novel idea. Why are you doing it that way? And I haven't heard this directly, but I suspect that there's at least a temptation to feel as though, why does he not trust us? It's like he's got to be in the room and he's got to keep an eye on us. He doesn't trust us. And I'm like, no, it's like I'm here because I love you and I want to. I want to impart to you what the scriptures say the same way I would with men, but do it in an environment that is just for women, so we can address things in a unique way. But that. My heart breaks for women in churches because I don't think they're getting pastoral care that God would want them to have.
Right. Yes. I think that's right. And what you mentioned there about, hey, don't you trust us, or you don't value us, or whatever that becomes sort of that underlying angst that's just floating in the system, waiting for an opportunity to erupt. Because basically it festers. And if it's not gladly embraced as this is actually our pastors trying to care for us, if it's not regarded that way, but is framed as a sort of demeaning of women or something like that, then it festers, and eventually it's going to erupt, and everybody will go up, how did this happen? Well, you didn't address it. So it is a perennial sort of issue, and in our modern context, it is where a lot of the fight is. Doesn't matter what denomination you're in. There's a form of this on the table that has to be addressed. And the prerequisite for all of these things is a kind of steady sober-mindedness. So that virtue of sober-mindedness as a qualification is it's different. Like, it's not just be stubborn and there's so many different ways to go wrong, but it's like the only way to go right is to start with, I am not drunk on my passions or other people's passions, right? I'm sober, and therefore I can hear feedback, negative feedback, critical feedback, and not and not get real defensive and feel like I've got to I can be curious. I can ask questions and say, okay, so you feel that way. Help me understand a little bit better where you're coming from, because it's not clicking yet. You think because I said this in the sermon that therefore I don't, what again? You can act because you're under control, because God is your anchor. The criticism isn't debilitating, and it's not something that you have to worry about. You don't have to panic about your reputation because you're trusting in God. You want to pre-please him, and therefore you're actually able to listen well. You're actually able to do it because you're not, this is the tethered piece, right? You're not tethered to their emotional response to you. You're not, their disapproval or unhappiness isn't debilitating. Why? Because you believe in the doctrine of justification by faith alone. You believe that God approves you in Christ, and that's your that's your first qualification. So now it's just, man, who's sufficient for these things? God's making me sufficient, and I can lead through this.
Yeah. Yeah. As you're talking about that, I can imagine the way that a lot of people read leadership books or think about leadership. They think, here is the fix, the solution. Right. So if I'm in a rough leadership environment, I want to read Dr. Rigney's book, and then things will get much better because I want to be a sober-minded leader, and then everything will be calm. And I think what I would just want to point out is just like, if you are the kind of leader that is sober-minded and leads the way that God would have you lead, there is a good chance it'll get worse. And the fact that it gets worse means you're over the target. And because you're over the target, that's where the real work of shepherding and discipleship can begin, because you're able to use their reactivity as an entry point into whatever problem it is that they're dealing with, that they need to address with the tools of Scripture. And you could be the shepherd that leads them there. Yes. But it's so tempting to panic along with them and do what the world does, which is, I'm so sorry, I was wrong, please forgive me. Do I need to make a public statement? Let me apologize in front of these people here. Let me donate money to your organization, and freak out to all to keep the pressure off. But even that doesn't work. That's only a temporary reprieve, but you've now incentivized the sorts of behavior that'll make it worse the next time. And then, well, last time this is what we had to do, and he caved, and so we'll do it again. Yeah. So at some point, you've got to have the marbles to say, I'm not going to do this, but to be sober-minded about it, not stubborn-minded about it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that's the key thing, again, about sober-mindedness there is it allows for course correction, right? You can actually, so you ought to be the most, earlier I was kind of taking a shot at the reasonable people, because they're often the ones who are trying to negotiate apologies. You said something, somebody got hurt, and therefore you get in a room, and now the expectation is that both of you are going to leave having apologized for something. So they're willing to admit that, they shouldn't have screamed in the congregational meeting. That was a little too much. They just cared that much, and so that's why they screamed. Now, can you also admit that you shouldn't have said what you said, or that you were harsh? And if you go, but I wasn't harsh, so no, I'm not going to apologize. Well, why aren't you being a Christian? Are you saying you're sinless? No, I'm not saying I'm sinless, but I am saying I'm arrogant. Yeah, I walked in integrity. And so reasonable people in that sense try to negotiate the apologies. But there is a way in which you ought to be the most reasonable person in the room. If someone comes to you with an open Bible, then you're like, I got an open mind. If someone comes to you with new information, well, I can soberly consider it and factor it in and realize, you know what? I made a decision based on partial information. It was mistaken. I now know more of this situation, and we need to course correct. And that's not like how are we going to manage the fallout, or what's going to happen? It's like, this is just leadership. Don't panic about having to not, you weren't God, you didn't know everything. And so you made, a decision based on partial information. Welcome to earth. That's fine. Lead through it. What people are hungry for is that kind of steadiness. It's what your wife wants. It's what your kids want. It's what your church wants. It's what your school wants. It's what the nation wants, for goodness sake, can we just have some steadiness? Somebody who goes, I'm not omnicompetent. I don't know everything. There are questions I don't have the answer to about how the future is going to go. But I know God, I'm planted on the rock, and I can press on. I can lead through this because he's going to lead and guide. And I know his word. And so that's what the desire is, the need is that kind of clarity, that kind of steadiness, that kind of readiness to act that's not going to pass the buck, but is going to actually take responsibility. And it is attractive. And the thing it will do is if you're in an institution or an organization where it's already a little bit wonky, then you sobering up will make it worse in the short term. Because what you're going to do is what your institution is doing is it's settling for long-term chronic pain rather than go through acute pain of dealing with it. And so when you take a stand, when you get clarity and you lead ahead, you should expect the sabotage, and it will actually erupt because you're trying to bring the acute pain in order to address the actual issue. But if you press through it, if you can weather that storm, you can actually form the new sort of nucleus of a healthy institution that operates well with boundaries and that knows, like, we don't just succumb to social stampedes. We don't just get overwhelmed by emotional dominoes, and we don't have reactive anxiety storms that course through here. Like, we actually operate, sober-mindedness can spread. And so when that happens, now you may have lost some people, that will happen, but what you have left is actually healthier. And then when you're adding to it, it's adding to health, not just adding cancer, not just, accumulating unendingly because people are a blob of emotions that are looking to, run left and then run right and then run left and run right. But there's something actually healthy about it. But you should really think, if I'm a sober-minded leader, the kind that Paul says we ought to be, then you ought to expect at some level for the kind of things that happened to Paul to happen to you. And right. Where that guy went, there was usually a riot or two. That's like Paul, like in the book, like one of my key case studies is Paul in going back to Jerusalem in Acts 21 to 24. And that entire thing, he is as sober-minded as the day is long. And everybody else is losing their ever-loving minds. And the government doesn't know what to do. His accusers don't know what to do. It is just a big chaotic, like all Jerusalem was in confusion. Why? Paul didn't even this is what's amazing. He didn't even go there to preach. He just came back and they were like, hey, can you go help out? These people have been saying lies about you. Would you go and prove them wrong? And Paul's like, I would be more than happy to put to rest this slander that I want Jews to stop, respecting Moses. So yeah, I'll go to the temple and do it. And it's like, he's just going there to like try to quell this, and then kaboom, the whole thing blows up. And Paul's like, that's about what I expected. Can I have the mic? I would like to preach now, right? Like the mob gathers and he's like, I think this is a great opportunity to give my testimony, and I will do so right now. And the tribune in that situation is so dumbstruck by the fact that Paul was getting beaten to death and now he wants to go back out there, that he's like, I guess you can. I will let you go out and address this crowd. And so it is a remarkable thing to see, like the riot comes because of Paul's sober-mindedness, not despite it. And that's true all throughout the book of Acts. It's been true through church history. And so that's the kind of leaders we need today. Yeah, absolutely. And that's not the sort of thing you're going to put on your brochure, raising funds for church planning. Right. Like, I want to go to Cincinnati and I want to try to start a few riots, and then hopefully I'll get to preach the gospel while they're beating me with sticks. That's right. That's right. Yeah, I've thought of this so many times. Like, I'll catch a news story or something like this about things happening in the world or politics, and I'll just think, are there any grown-ups? Is there anybody who is, and to use your language, like, are there any sober-minded, just steady people that aren't caught up in the frenzy? And that, I mean, there's a place for anger, there's a place for outrage, but to not be driven by it, but to let that just inform kind of your. Mm-hmm. Be aware of how you're emotionally reacting to injustice around you, and that I think that there's a good place for that. But it seemed like there's just the outrage is the cruise control is set at outrage, right? And there's no passions drive the show like that. We live in a culture where passions run everything, and it's not that emotions are bad. It's that they're good, but they have to be governed. God intended, he governs us, our intellect, our will, and then we govern our passions, those instincts. We have to learn to bring them to heel, to shepherd them, because we really do want to feel deeply. We like, it's good to be outraged by the things that God did. We should abhor things. We should weep with those who. Our emotions really are important, but in fact, they're so important that they cannot be allowed to run the show. That's how important they are. You don't put them in charge, and you don't put them in charge of you, and you don't put other people's emotion in charge of you. Right? That's the trap, and the trick is you can't let yours or other people's be the guiding light. And everything in our culture says no, feelings run. Feelings must be validated, encouraged, That's your most authentic self. That's what you have to follow. Follow your heart, follow other people's heart, follow other people's hurt feelings. And what we need is, no, that's not what God wants. There's a better way. And if we do it, it's actually beautiful, wonderful, life-giving. It actually is a shelter and a protection for other people to have leaders that aren't like, one of the ways that, the publisher said, part of what we're trying to get at with this book, is you want to be the sort of leader that when the crisis happens and you're not there, when you walk in the room, everybody goes, "Oh, thank God."
Yeah.
Right. Like that when everything's been lit on fire, it's a crisis and everything, but you want to be the sort of leader that when you walk in the room, everybody breathes a sigh of relief, like, okay. And it's not because you're omnicompetent and know everything, but it's just that what you're bringing in is some gravity and you're bringing joy. Yeah. You're doing the first in, last out, laughing loudest. Like, I'm going to be here and I'm going to bear it the longest. I'm going to be the first to bear it the longest. And I'm going to do so with joy in my heart. Even when there's a scanty meal in the land, I'm going to rejoice because I know God and I'm glad to do this. And everybody goes, "Oh, thank God." That's the kind of leader you want to be, not the sort of leader who they go, "We've got to get this fixed before he shows up." Because if he does, like, you don't want to be the guy who brings more angst into the room, who just brings your own, insecurities, your own fears, your own defensiveness and reactivity into the room. And it's just you're just going to be another big thunderclap into the big storm. Don't be that. Instead, be the one who steadies it, and who they go, "Okay, now we're going to be okay because he's coming in with Jesus. He's bringing Jesus into this room because he's steady. Jesus has steadied him."
Yeah, I love that. May God give us more leaders like that, man.
Amen.
So important. Man, I could talk about this for another hour, but we ought to wrap it up here for the sake of time.
Yeah.
So, do you have any final comments or anything that you wanted to hit on that you forgot about but would like to address here at the end?
Yeah. I think probably the only thing is it has to start with your own. Everybody wants to save the world. No one wants to help mom with the dishes. It starts in your house. It starts in your own. And this is a convicting thing for me when I think about the most important leadership I exercise every day, or in my life, is the one with the 4 other people who live in my house, my wife and my 3 boys. That's where it is. And that's where I want the bulk of, my first prayers. I want to be there. My first responsibility, I want to be there. And so, if you're a leader and you're thinking, where do I start? It's like, start there. That's the fundamental qualification for all leadership is, can you manage your household well and lead there? And then work out from there. I learn by all the different places where I have to lead, but I want to apply it sort of from the inside out, right? That's where again, start from the inner circles and work its way out. Trust God to bless it in every step along the way.
Fantastic. Well, brother, do you have any books to promote, or where can we find you? What are some ways to follow up after this, and I can put them in the show notes too?
For sure. So about 8 or 9 months ago, I had a book come out called Courage: How the Gospel Creates Christian Fortitude. So that one's been out for a bit, and it's relevant to some of the things that we're talking about, and will probably be, I think, sort of some of the stuff I'll talk about at the conference in April. So if that appeals to you. Then Leadership and Emotional Sabotage is available for pre-order right now at emotionalsabotage.com. And so you can go there and pre-order that. I think it starts shipping in about a month in March. And I think one offer that the publishers put together is if you buy 5 copies for your team or for your pastoral team or your school board or whatever it is, that we can set up a private Q&A with me after you've read the book to kind of debrief, talk, apply, do some Q&A. And so if that has appeal, then buy a bunch of them and we'll make that happen. But I'm excited about the book. It is the sort of, it's a small book. It's a short book. I read it, did the audiobook yesterday. And it took me about 3.5 hours to read the whole thing. So when you think about, man, there's years that went into those 3.5 hours. Do you know what I mean? And so it's an interesting thing to go like, well, that was it. And, but I do think it's trying to get at the heart of what kind of leaders do we need. It doesn't answer every problem because I'm not going to be able to do that for you. But I'm hopeful that by drawing attention to the way that leadership works what's needed, what the challenges are, and the particular pressures that God will work it in whatever situation you're facing.
Yeah. One thing I appreciated about the book, just like you sent me a copy, and I was able to read, I guess a late draft of it, but
yeah,
you have a good economy of words and good labels. A lot of times there are ideas or things phenomena we experience or observe, but sometimes we just need a label that captures it. And so White Knight is a good example. And I wrote down several today as you were talking. Progressive girl flop. It's like, I know exactly what that is, but I didn't have a word for it, but now I do.
Name the world. Name the world. That's what we do. Adam named the animals. We're just going to keep naming stuff.
That's right. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Thanks for tuning into the Plain Speech Podcast. Don't forget to register for the King's Domain Conference. If you want to find out more information about that, you can go to genderedvirtue.com. You can also get there by going to moscowmood.com, but that has all the information about the conference. And Joe will be one of our keynote speakers, and you're gonna love it. I talked to Toby Sumpter, and we've mapped out his content. So I'm super excited about what we've got in store for you. This will be very encouraging and edifying to you. genderedvirtue.com, and all the things that podcasters say, like, subscribe, leave a comment, send us money or something. I don't have a Patreon, but people say that. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.